In December 1942, over the Solomon Islands, a 19-year-old gunner named Eddie Kowalski stood inside a B-17 bomber, holding tight to a Browning M2 machine gun that rattled like crazy. Suddenly, a Japanese Zero fighter came into view about 300 yards away, zipping across his line of sight from left to right. Eddie did what came naturally. He aimed straight at the center of the enemy plane and fired off 50 rounds. The tracers lit up the air, but every bullet flew harmlessly behind the enemy. The Japanese pilot didn't even flinch. He just kept flying like nothing happened. And Eddie's ammo count dropped fast. But this wasn't just Eddie's mistake. Scenes like this played out all the time during the early years of World War II. American gunners were motivated, well-trained, and armed with some of the best weapons out there. But they kept missing. Not just once in a while. Nearly every time. In early 1943, the Army Air Forces reviewed gun camera footage from bomber missions in both Europe and the Pacific. The findings were grim. Gunners were hitting less than 4% of the time when shooting at targets moving across their field of view. That means out of 100 bullets fired at an enemy fighter flying sideways to them, 96 missed completely. To break that down, a typical dogfight lasted maybe 8 to 12 seconds before the enemy pulled away. The Browning M2 fired about 800 rounds a minute, or roughly 13 per second. So in a 10-second fight, a gunner could fire about 130 rounds. With only a 4% hit rate, maybe 5 would connect. That wasn't nearly enough to take down a Japanese Zero, or something tougher, like the German FW-190. These fighters could take dozens of hits and still stay airborne. The losses were massive. In 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force lost an average of 188 bombers every month over Europe. Each B-17 carried 10 crew members. That's nearly 1,900 men lost, killed, captured, or missing every month. And a big part of that came from bombers being unable to defend themselves. The gunners weren't doing anything wrong based on what they'd been taught. They tracked the planes, kept their sights on target, and fired in controlled bursts. Their effort wasn't the issue. The real problem was physics, and physics doesn't care how brave you are. Most gunners aimed directly at what they could see. It made sense. Point, shoot, hit. That worked for targets that weren't moving too fast. But enemy fighters weren't moving at 20 miles per hour like a running deer. They were crossing the sky at over 300 miles per hour. Some late-war jets, like the German Me-262, hit 540. At those speeds, bullets couldn't reach the target fast enough. A .50 caliber round from the M2 moved at around 2,900 feet per second. Sounds fast, and it is. But when the enemy is hundreds of yards away and moving that quickly, it still wasn't fast enough. Take a Zero moving at 300 miles per hour. That's 440 feet every second. If it's 300 yards out, that's 900 feet. It takes about 0.31 seconds of bullet to reach that spot. But in that short time, the Zero had already moved another 136 feet forward. So, even though the gunner aimed right at it, the bullets ended up hitting empty space where the plane used to be. This problem had a name: deflection error. Experts had known about it before the war, at least in theory. But solving it in real combat was a whole different challenge. Hitting a fast-moving target required aiming way ahead of it, sometimes 15 to 20 feet in front. That meant pointing at what looked like empty sky and trusting the enemy would fly into your stream of bullets. It went against every natural instinct. Instructors tried to teach this during training, but results weren't great. At the Army Air Force's Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, trainees practiced in simulators, shot from moving trucks, and studied how to lead a target. But none of that really prepared them for the chaos of real combat. The issue was that deflection wasn't one simple rule. It changed all the time. It depended on how fast the target was flying, at what angle, how far away it was, whether it was climbing or diving, or whether the bomber itself was turning. A bald turret gunner named B-17 facing a head-on attack from a German Bf-109 needed a completely different aim than if that same fighter was coming in from the side. And gunners had only a few seconds to figure out, while under fire, dealing with damage, and breathing through a fogged-up mask at 25,000 feet. Even the ones who tried deflection shooting often gave up after a few misses. They'd aim ahead, fire, and see nothing hit. So they'd assume they were aiming too far ahead and start pulling their aim closer to the target, only to miss again. The gunners were adjusting their aim, but in the wrong direction. They were trusting what their eyes told them instead of the physics they didn't fully understand. Gun camera footage from 1943 shows the same pattern again and again. The first shots had some forward lead, but the follow-up bursts pulled back until the gunners were firing directly at or even behind the target. Losses kept piling up. During the October 1943 missions to Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers out of 291 sent out, a 20% loss rate. The planes that made it back were often full of wounded, with damaged engines and systems barely holding together. In the post-mission briefings, the same frustration came up over and over. We were firing. Our guns worked. But we just weren't hitting anything. Something had to change, fast. If things continued like this, the Allied bombing campaign would collapse long before reaching Berlin. The answer had actually been written down way back in 1924, buried in a file cabinet, forgotten. It came from a man most aircrews had never heard of, Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. Not the older historical figure with the same name, but an American artillery officer who had a deep understanding of ballistics. While working as an instructor at the Army's Field Artillery School, he wrote a paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. Puckle wasn't just an academic. He'd served in World War I and had seen early, clumsy attempts at air combat. He realized back then that as aircraft speeds increased, traditional shooting methods wouldn't work. His paper broke the issue down with cold, clear math. Once aircraft hit speeds over 150 miles per hour, he wrote, the amount of lead needed became too much for human instinct to handle. He showed that hitting a target moving at 250 miles per hour across a gunner's view meant aiming 4 or 5 full aircraft lengths ahead. Puckle's report included detailed charts for different target speeds, angles, and distances. For example, to hit a plane flying 300 miles per hour at a 90-degree angle from 200 yards out, a gunner would need to aim 47 feet ahead. At 400 yards, that jumped to 94 feet. The numbers were huge, and so was the warning in his conclusion. Without some kind of mechanical help, air gunners would soon become useless. The paper was filed away and ignored. As military aviation advanced through the 1920s and 30s, gunnery training didn't keep up. Instructors stuck to World War I era methods, teaching things like breath control and basic marksmanship, as if the gunners were shooting at still targets from the ground. A few people spoke up about the need to change, but they were brushed off. The belief was that American shooters had always been great. Frontier legends, war heroes, expert marksmen. Surely those skills would carry over to the air. They didn't. When the U.S. entered the war in late 1941, gunnery training was nowhere near ready for what modern combat required. The training program was only 4 weeks long. Each student fired about 1,000 rounds during the entire course, mostly at stationary or slow-moving targets that flew straight at predictable speeds. None of the exercises came close to preparing them for a fighter, like the FW-190 diving into a bomber formation at 400 miles per hour, while twisting and rolling. Graduates got their wings, flew overseas, and learned the hard way that their training hadn't prepared them at all. By mid-1942, some commanders started digging through old research, desperate for answers. That's when Captain Robert Williams, working in the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Analysis Unit, found Puckle's paper stored in the archives at Wright Field. He read it straight through, and then immediately sent a memo to his superior with just 2 words underlined 3 times. He knew. Puckle had predicted everything. Almost 2 decades before the first B-17 even flew a combat mission. His math was still solid. His warning had been spot on. And now, hundreds of airmen had lost their lives because no one had listened. The question wasn't whether Puckle had been right. He absolutely was. The real question now was, could anything actually be done to fix the problem? Try and get gunners to manually calculate lead angles while under fire just wasn't realistic. No one could do math like that in the middle of a dogfight. But if mental math was an option, maybe something else could work. The British had already started figuring that out, driven by their own crisis in the summer of 1940. RAF Squadron 609, flying Spitfires out of Middle Wallop, faced almost the exact same challenge American gunners would deal with later. Their planes were top-notch. Their pilots were courageous, but they kept missing. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July 1940 and found their hit rate against German fighters like the Bf-109 was just 6%. That meant only 6 out of every 100 rounds fire hit anything. A Spitfire only had enough ammo for about 16 seconds of firing. Pilots were emptying their guns and watching enemy planes escape untouched. Squadron leader Horace Darley decided to take a risk. He grounded the entire unit for 3 days in early August 1940. Even though Britain was right in the middle of the Battle of Britain and desperately needed every available fighter in the air. During those 3 days, the squadron ran live-fire experiments that went completely against official RAF training rules. Before the war, Darley had been a skilled clay pigeon shooter, and that gave him a unique insight. He realized something many military trainers had missed. Top shotgun shooters didn't rely on calculations to hit moving targets. They didn't think about it, they just felt it. Their brains automatically processed emotion, and their hands responded without conscious effort. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn to do the same. He set up a no-frills experiment. A Hurricane aircraft towed a target banner across a gunnery range, while Spitfire pilots made repeated passes to shoot at it. But instead of telling them to line up a perfect shot or figure out the right lead, Darley gave them a very different instruction. Don't aim at all. He told the pilots to simply follow the movement of the target with their eyes and start firing while still turning into it. No precise calculations. Just let the motion of the plane create the lead naturally. Trust your instincts, not your aim. At first, it was a mess. Shots missed by dozens of feet. Bullets flew through open sky. But Darley made them keep at it. Again and again, 40 practice runs each over 3 days. No lessons about angles or ballistics. Just one rule. Shoot while you're still turning, not after lining up the shot. By the 3rd day, something started to click. The pilot's accuracy slowly climbed. Not a huge jump, just from about 6% up to 12%. But that was double the number of hits. And in real combat, that meant double the enemy planes damaged or destroyed. Darley recorded the results and sent them up the chain of command. In his report, he made an important observation. The pilots who improved fastest weren't necessarily the best shooters before the war. They were the ones who could let go of the urge to carefully aim and instead rely on their reflexes and peripheral vision. Darley argued that conscious thinking was just too slow for modern air battles. The trick was to train the subconscious to handle the timing automatically, just like a baseball player tracks and catches a fly ball without doing math in his head. The RAF began sharing Darley's findings, but adoption was hit or miss. Some squadrons jumped on board. Others dismissed it as guesswork. Training staff, especially, resisted. They'd spent years teaching classic marksmanship, and this approach seemed to throw that all out. But the squadrons that gave a real shot started seeing better results. Their kill rates went up during the fall of 1940. By early 1941, even if it wasn't in the official manuals, Darley's method was being quietly adopted in the field. American military observers in Britain took note. They documented everything Darley had done, but the U.S. faced a different challenge. Fighter pilots could learn to use instinct through practice, but bomber gunners? They didn't have that luxury. A Spitfire pilot could steer the whole aircraft to help with deflection. A waist gunner in AB-17 couldn't. The bomber flew straight and steady through enemy fire. The gunner stood in one spot, aiming manually. He couldn't use movement to help create lead. He had just his hands and his line of sight. So if thinking was too slow and instinct wasn't possible, the only answer left was technology. That's where the Massachusetts Institute of Technology came in. Specifically, Division 7 of the Radiation Laboratory, formed in early 1942. The name sounded like it had something to do with nuclear research. That was the point. It helped keep their real project secret. Fire control systems for aircraft guns. Division 7 was led by Drive Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer who had spent years working on aircraft navigation using gyroscopes. Draper saw the gunnery issue for what it was, a prediction problem, not a shooting one. The key wasn't aiming at the target. It was knowing where the target would be by the time the bullets arrived. By July 1943, his lab had built a working prototype, the Mark 14 computing gunsight. It looked like something out of a science fiction story. It was a reflector gunsight, powered by the plane's electrical system, and connected to a 28-pound gyroscope setup. Here's how it worked. The gunner used a dial to match the target's wingspan to a scale inside the sight that told the system how far away the plane was. Then, as they're going to track the enemy for a couple of seconds, the gyroscope measured how fast the target was moving across the sight picture. Now, the magic happened. The Mark 14 used a set of gears and cams, basically a mechanical analog computer, to crunch the numbers in real time. It used the gunner's range setting, the speed and direction of the target, and the known behavior of .50 caliber bullets to figure out exactly how far ahead to aim. The result? Instead of aiming directly at the target, the gunner now aimed at a glowing dot in front of it. If everything was set correctly and the tracking was smooth, that showed exactly where to shoot. This gunsight could solve equations that would take a person minutes to work out on paper, doing it 30 times per second, constantly updating as the target moved and changed range. In August 1943, testing at Naval Air Station Norfolk in Virginia delivered results that were hard to believe. Gunners who had never hit more than 5% of crossing targets suddenly jumped to 18% accuracy on their first day using the Mark 14 computing gunsight. After just a week of practice, some were hitting more than 25%. That was 5 times better than traditional aiming, and 5 times more enemy planes hit or brought down. But there was a problem. Mass producing and installing tens of thousands of these advanced sights would take time. Time the Allies didn't have. Large-scale production didn't kick off until early 1944, and instead of retrofitting older bombers, the sights were mostly reserved for brand-new aircraft coming off the line. That meant many gunners flying missions in late 1943 and early 1944 were still using basic iron sights or simple reflector sights with no aiming assistance. What they needed was a method that worked right now, with no need for new equipment or aircraft modifications, something that could work with the gear already in use. The answer didn't come from engineers or scientists. It came from the gunners themselves, especially those serving in the Pacific, where the skies were clearer and engagement distances were often longer than in Europe. One of them was Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming. By March 1944, Fleming had flown 31 combat missions as a waist gunner in the air group aboard the carrier USS Lexington. He had survived 4 plane crashes and fired about 40,000 rounds in actual combat. He had seen hits on 7 enemy planes, and he kept a detailed notebook. Fleming's notebook was filled with hand-drawn sketches of enemy planes. But what made it special were the lines he had drawn ahead of the planes' noses, showing exactly where he had aimed to get those hits. He didn't measure in feet or yards. He measured in plane lengths, aiming 1, 2, or even 3 aircraft lengths ahead of the target. On March 14, 1944, Fleming showed his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butcher, a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's top tacticians. O'Hare immediately recognized the value. This was real-world, combat-tested deflection data gathered firsthand. O'Hare didn't waste time. He ordered Fleming to start training every gun in the group, not with lectures or theory, but with hands-on drills. Fleming introduced what became known as the spot shooting method. Here's how it worked. Gunners stood their positions while another crew member walked by, holding a model airplane on a stick. As the mock plane moved past at different angles, Fleming taught gunners to aim a set number of plane lengths in front of it, 1 for shallow angles, 2 for moderate, and 3 or more for sharper angles. The idea was to give them a simple visual cue they could instantly apply in combat. Just count the lengths forward and shoot. At first, the ship's gunnery officer was skeptical, but he approved live testing during operations near Truck Lagoon in late March 1944. They compared ammunition use and confirmed hits from the previous 8 weeks with the results after Fleming's training. The outcome was clear. Before the new method, gunners were hitting 4.2 enemy aircraft per 100 rounds against crossing targets. Just 6 weeks later, That number jumped to 9.1 hits per 100. Their effectiveness had more than doubled. Word spread fast. By May 1944, Fleming's spot shooting method was being used on other carriers, Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each ship's gunnery officers made slight changes, but the main idea stayed the same. Give gunners a way to see how far ahead to aim based on what the enemy looked like, not based on math. It worked because it matched how human vision and the brain really work. People are great at comparing sizes, like knowing how big something looks compared to something else. But we're terrible at guessing exact distances, especially in fast-moving situations. Telling a gunner to lead by 50 feet didn't help much. What does 50 feet even look like at 300 yards? But saying, aim 2 plane lengths ahead gave them an instant, useful reference. The enemy aircraft itself became the measuring stick. By mid-1944, the Army Air Forces began teaching a similar method. They called it radius of action shooting. New manuals started showing pictures with lead distances based on target wingspan or fuselage length. At the 8th Air Force Gunnery School in Lavenham, England, the entire training program was redesigned around this approach in June 1944. It worked. Losses were still high, but things were improving. In July 1944, bomber missions had an average loss rate of 3.4%, down from 5.2% the previous October. That change meant hundreds of crew members who might have been lost were now coming home. But knowing the method and actually using it under fire were two very different things. Even with the spot shooting method, the human brain still worked against itself once the shooting began. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces noticed this happening again and again in 1944. It wasn't that gunners didn't know what to do. They could explain lead distances perfectly during post-mission briefings. The real problem was that, under pressure, all that conscious knowledge faded away. Instinct took over. And instinct screamed, aimed straight at the threat. Captain Harold Clean, a military psychologist based at Bovington, studied this issue closely by combining gun camera footage with after-action interviews. He spotted a pattern and gave it a name, threat fixation collapse. Here's what it looked like. A gunner would start an attack using the correct lead. But as the enemy plane got closer and the pressure rose, their aim would slowly drift back toward the target's nose, then fall behind entirely. They ended up firing at or even behind the plane, wasting shots and missing their chance. This collapse happened fastest during head-on attacks. In those moments, fighters were closing in at speeds over 500 miles per hour. Gunners had maybe 2 seconds to respond before enemy fire hit. Under that kind of stress, rational technique broke down. The body reverted to survival mode, point, shoot, react. The only real fix was training so repetitive, so ingrained, that the brain didn't need to think anymore. Deflection shooting had to become second nature, like walking or catching a ball. But back in 1942 and 1943, the military simply didn't have the time or resources to train gunners to that level. By late 1944, things changed. The Allies had more control over the skies and better training systems in place. Gunnery schools were able to expand. What used to be a 4-week course in 1942 stretched to 8 weeks, then 10. Instead of firing 1,000 rounds in training, students were now firing 5,000, and more than half of those were at fast-moving targets, not slow ones. One of the most effective programs came from the Naval Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, Florida, starting in August 1944. They mounted .50 caliber guns on motorized turrets that could spin and elevate quickly. Fast-moving boats towed targets across the water at speeds up to 60 miles per hour, constantly changing angles and distances. Gunners would practice against these targets 50 to 70 times a day. There were no lectures, no corrections, just repetition. Fire, check your hits, adjust, try again. The brain learned through feedback much faster than it could through classroom instruction. Eventually, elite gunners, those who had flown 30 or more missions, began showing something special on camera. Even under heavy fire, even during chaos, they kept their aim steady. When enemy fighters like the FW-190 ripped through the formation, these veterans didn't flinch. They maintained proper lead, as if by reflex. Many later admitted they were terrified in those moments, convinced they were seconds from death, but their hands didn't betray it. They had reached what martial artists call mushin, no mind. Their training took over when thinking couldn't. But reaching that level took time, ammo, and missions, and most gunners never got there. The math was harsh. To create just one truly instinctive gunner took 5,000 rounds and 10 weeks of intense training. But the air war needed tens of thousands of new gunners every few months. There just wasn't enough time or material to get everyone to that point. So most gunners ended up in what trainers called the conscious competence stage. They could shoot correctly when they had time to think. But under surprise or extreme stress, their skills often broke down. They reverted to instinct, and instinct didn't lead shots. This led to big differences in how effective bomber crews were. One bomber group might repel an attack with deadly precision. Another, made up of less experienced gunners, might get torn apart. German fighter pilots picked up on this quickly. They learned how to spot bombers with weak defensive fire. During their first pass, they'd watch for hesitation or poor aim. Those were the planes they'd focus on. If formation responded with fast, accurate, heavy fire, the Germans often broke off or looked for softer targets. The deflection shooting breakthrough, sparked by British trial and error and American urgency, didn't stop at the end of World War II in 1945. The core lesson stayed the same. You don't aim at where a target is, you aim at where it's going to be. That concept became a foundation for every modern weapon system that followed. The Mark 14 computing gunsight evolved into the Mark 18, used during Korean War. From there, systems advanced into digital fire control computers capable of factoring in dozens of variables at once. By the Vietnam era, fighter jets like the F-4 Phantom used radar-assisted gun sights that automatically calculated deflection. The pilot just had to keep the target within a certain range. Everything else happened automatically. The Phantom's advanced lead computing optical sight system could do in microseconds what Draper's mechanical gyroscopes once did in fractions of a second. Today, most air-to-air combat happens at long range using missiles. Modern weapons often lead targets by miles instead of feet. But the physics behind it all hasn't changed, just the way we handle it. Missiles like the AIM-120 AMRAAM use onboard guidance and radar to constantly adjust course, tracking not just what the target is, but where it will be. It's doing deflection shooting at a scale and speed no human could match, calculating thousands of times per second. The F-22 Raptor's radar doesn't just follow targets. It predicts their future paths based on current speed and acceleration, and then positions the aircraft or selects weapons to match. In other words, it's doing the same kind of math Bill Fleming once worked out with pencil sketches and notebook, now powered by computers running trillions of calculations per second. Even today, fighter pilots still learn the basics of deflection shooting. At Navy Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, students practice guns-only dogfights, even though missiles are main weapons in modern combat. Why? Because these drills build critical spatial awareness, a sense of how fast targets are moving, how they're angled, and where to intercept. A pilot who can instinctively track lead angles understands things like closure rate, pursuit curves, and angle off, the building blocks of every successful engagement, whether using guns or missiles. The same ideas apply beyond aircraft. Today's defense systems, like the Phalanx CIWS on Navy ships or the CRAM systems protecting military bases, are high-speed versions of what World War II gunners had to do by eye. The Phalanx system, for example, fires 4,500 rounds per minute, about 75 every second, at incoming threats like missiles or planes. Its radar is constantly adjusting the aim point in real time. It's doing exactly what Eddie Kowalski tried to do in 1942, just faster and without panic. Even combat video games like War Thunder and DCS simulate deflection mechanics. New players often experience the same frustration World War II gunners did, watching every round miss behind the enemy until they finally realize they need to aim ahead. Over time, skilled players develop that same unconscious ability to lead targets without thinking. The leap from 4% hit rates in early 1943 to over 20% by the end of 1944 was one of the biggest tactical improvements of the entire war. And it didn't come from building better guns or flying more planes. It came from training people to fight against their own instincts and work with the science instead of against it. Thousands of lives were saved because someone finally recognized that point and shoot doesn't work in the air. Fighters that might have escaped were shot down. Bombing runs that could have failed reached their targets. And it all came down to one thing: learning to trust the physics over fear. The gunners who taught themselves to shoot at empty sky, who ignored what felt right and followed what worked, showed just how adaptable humans can be. We're not stuck with our first instincts. With the right knowledge, enough training, and sometimes just pure survival pressure, we can reprogram ourselves to make better choices. That lesson, born from desperate battles over Europe and Pacific, still matters today. Anywhere people face fast-moving problems where their gut says one thing, but the truth says another, this story still applies. In the skies above Europe and the Pacific, between tracer fire and the roar of engines, a quiet revolution took place. It wasn't about building a bigger bomb or inventing a new plane. It was about rewiring the human brain to do something completely unnatural. Trust what it couldn't see. At its core, deflection shooting wasn't just a technique. It was a challenge to instinct. A gut reaction tells us to aim at what's threatening us, to point and shoot at the thing we fear. But in the air, that didn't work. At hundreds of miles per hour, aiming directly at a target meant always being behind it. The enemy was already gone by the time your bullets arrived. And that's where the real breakthrough came. Not from engineering alone, but from understanding how people think under stress. This is a story of human cognition, pressure, adaptation, and learning. It's about what happens when instinct fails, and what's possible when training, feedback, and understanding step in. When the war started, most gunners were relying on skills designed for a slower world. They were taught to breathe, aim, and shoot like they were on a rifle range. The problem was, the battlefield had changed, and their minds hadn't caught up. They missed. They died. And for a time, no one knew how to fix it. Then came innovation, not just in tech, but in thought. The British began experimenting with intuitive shooting, grounded in the muscle memory of clay pigeon shooters. The Americans followed with desperation-fueled research, digging up forgotten ballistic studies, designing mechanical gun sights, and expanding training programs. And in the middle of it all were the gunners themselves. People like Bill Fleming, who turned his personal combat experience into a practical method any crew member could understand. His sketches and simple rule of 2 or 3 plane lengths ahead saved lives, not because they were complex, but because they worked with how the human brain actually processed motion and space. This shift away from theory and toward usable instinct was key. It proved that the brain could be retrained, that even in chaos, people could override fear and fall back on practice response, that a man in a freezing turret at 25,000 feet could ignore every instinct screaming, "Shoot now," and instead wait track and aim where the enemy would be. It wasn't easy. Most gunners never reached the point of full unconscious competence. But those who did, those who hit without thinking, reshaped the air war. And that's what makes this story so relevant today. We live in a world where reaction time matters. Whether it's flying a jet, intercepting a missile, playing a competitive video game, or even making high-speed decisions in everyday life, we constantly face situations where our first instinct might not be the best one, where the thing that feels right might actually be completely wrong. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Instinct isn't always the answer. Training is. This isn't just a military truth. It's a human truth. We want to trust our gut. It's fast, it's emotional, it's wired into us. But when the world moves faster than instinct can handle, we have to go deeper. We have to learn to think differently. We have to create new habits that become faster than thought. The gunners who survived the skies of World War II learned that the hard way. They taught themselves to fire into empty space and hit their mark. And we see echoes of that everywhere now. Modern fighter jets don't rely on human reaction times. They use sensors, radar, and advanced computing to predict motion. Anti-air systems like the Phalanx don't panic. They just calculate, adjust, and fire. But the principle is still the same. Predict, don't react. That mindset came from the lessons taught above Schweinfurt, over Midway, and in every bomber formation that had to learn the hard way where to aim. Even in video games, the best players succeed not because they think faster, but because they've trained their brains to anticipate. They know when to fire not by aiming at what's on screen, but by feeling where the enemy will be. The same skill, the same mental rewiring, the same transformation from confusion to competence. So what can we take from all this? First, that instinct isn't destiny. Just because something feels right doesn't mean it is. That's not weakness. It's reality. Our instincts were built for a different world. In high-speed environments, whether on a battlefield, a cockpit, or a boardroom, instinct will often get it wrong. Second, that training works if it's the right kind. Not all practice is equal. The best training matches how the brain actually works. It builds confidence through repetition, feedback, and clear visual reference. It moves behavior from thought to reflex. That's how you get from theory to survival. And finally, we learn that human adaptability is stronger than we give it credit for. The gunners of World War II didn't have perfect tools or perfect training, but they had grit, creativity, and a will to live. They learned to aim where nothing was visible, to fire before their minds gave them permission. And in doing so, they bought just enough time for the war to turn. They proved that with the right mindset, we can overcome even the most deeply wired fears. We can aim at what we can't see. We can hit targets that haven't arrived yet. We can retrain our instincts. And in the right moments, when it counts, we can outthink even ourselves. That's the true legacy of deflection shooting. It's not just about bullets or bombers. It's about the human ability to change, to learn, to survive by becoming something more than we were yesterday. When the enemy is fast and instinct is wrong, the only thing that matters is whether we train ourselves to aim ahead. And if we have, then we're already winning.